My name is Joyce Lane, and I'm a volunteer with San Diego 350. I want to start the program tonight with a land acknowledgement. Today, we are standing on the ancestral lands of the Kumeyaay people, the original native inhabitants of San Diego County. The Kumeyaay have lived in this region for more than 10,000 years. Kumeyaay lands once extended from the Pacific Ocean south to Ensenada, east to the sand dunes of the Colorado River, and north to Warner Springs Valley. Today, we pay respect to the Kumeyaay elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. The event tonight has been organized by San Diego 350, an inclusive volunteer organization devoted to climate change and climate injustice. We strive to create a movement to prevent the worst impacts of climate change and climate injustice. We strive to create a future that supports a livable planet and just society through education and outreach, public policy advocacy, and mobilizing people to take action. As part of our public policy efforts, we've just started a coalition effort to work on building electrification. And I think many of you who are here tonight are a part of that coalition. We're really glad you're here. This is an important, building electrification is an important element to achieving our climate goals and preventing climate chaos. We will tell you more about the coalition later and how you can get involved if you're not already. The webinar tonight is the first in a series of webinars about building electrification. And if you're attending tonight, we will make sure that you know about those future webinars. I don't think we've set the dates for those yet. Tonight, we'll be talking about how building electrification fits into the climate movement, why it's important, and how we can advocate for it here in the San Diego region. At the end of the program, we will have time for questions. Just a reminder that you can put those questions in the chat and we will come back to those. So if you have a question that comes up during the program, feel free to put it in the chat. We'll be compiling those and we'll ask them in that last part of the section, part of the program. We have three great speakers tonight. We have Amy Ryder, who is the local government and consumer inspiration lead for the California Decarbonization Coalition. We have Matt Gough, who's the senior campaign representative for the Sierra Club, and Linda Hutchins-Knowles, who's a California senior organizer with Mothers Out Front. And many of them have been on the front lines this week, getting gas ban ordinances in different cities throughout California. So I'm going to invite them each to say a little bit more about their organizations and the work before we get into the presentation. So Amy, do you want to tell us a little bit more about the California Decarbonization Coalition and your work?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Joyce. So yes, hi everyone. I'm Amy Ryder, and I'm actually with the Building Decarbonization Coalition. It's not specific to California, although we are centered here. And we are a membership-based not-for-profit, and we represent a really wide variety of stakeholders, including local governments and nonprofits. And I'll be speaking briefly to that later on as well. But we bring together a lot of different voices in the room around building electrification and including education around reach code opportunities.
Great, thank you. Matt, would you like to say a little bit more about your work?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Gough. I am, in fact, a senior campaign representative with the Sierra Club. I'm working on building electrification here in California. So the Sierra Club is the nation's oldest and largest grassroots environmental org. We work on a whole host of issues, building electrification among them. And so in my role, I work with Sierra Club volunteers and leaders and staff, as well as community leaders and activists across California to help build a base of education about the issues so that we can advocate for electrification in our local communities, at the regulatory agencies in California and with the governor, so ultimately we can solve the climate crisis. And I'm just so excited to be here tonight to see all the people on this call who are a part of this coalition looking to learn more and make an impact. So thanks for having me.
Great, thanks. And Linda. Linda, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Forgot to unmute. Thank you, Joyce. Yeah, I'm also so excited to see all of you, 80 people. That is really powerful. You guys are going to do some great things. Yeah, my name is Linda. I am the California Senior Organizer with Mothers Out Front. I began this work about 4 years ago as a volunteer with the Silicon Valley Mothers Out Front team. I started it with my good friend, and we basically built a movement here. And I loved it so much, I fell in love with the work. I became an organizer full-time with Mothers Out Front. And I also coached the team in San Francisco. We have been involved recently in building electrification, especially reach codes and gas bans in San Jose and about 8 other surrounding towns in Silicon Valley. So we're excited. I'll be sharing a case study with you about how we helped San Jose pass its gas ban and reach code that just recently got updated on Tuesday night. So stay tuned for that. Thanks.
Great, thanks. So I think we're going to go ahead and get into our presentation, and I think you are next, Linda.
Right. So I wanted to start off by just helping put some context around this part of the climate movement. So there's many ways we're working on the climate crisis. Energy is one of the big areas. So in the area of energy transition, we have folks that are working on leaving it in the ground. So working on the supply and reducing the supply of fossil fuels. So these folks are working on stopping pipelines, banning fracking, imposing setback limits. I think some of you are involved with those efforts as I have been. And then on the other side of it, we have boosting the demand for clean energy. So knowing that we will leave more gas in the ground, oil in the ground, if we have more renewable energy to use instead. So working on RSP standards, community choice energy, and for some groups putting a price on carbon, although that needs to be done with care not to pollute communities. And then in the middle, I think of it this way, it's just my way of framing it. We have building electrification because it kind of does some of both. So gas bans will help stop fossil fuel use because they're prohibiting the use of gas in new buildings. Reach codes and retrofits kind of incentivize the electrification by making it more costly to build with gas or incentivizing and providing funding to help retrofit to clean appliances in buildings. So that's just a little taste of it. I think this is also very cutting edge in the climate movement. I'm pretty new to this work myself in this area. It's super exciting because so much of our buildings, as Matt and Amy will share, are fueled by fossil fuels contributing to our climate crisis. So that's just a little overview, and I will pass it back to you, Joyce, for the next part.
Okay, and I'm going to call on Matt to take the next section.
Awesome. Thank you, folks. So one thing I will say before I jump into it, so we are going to cover a lot of material this evening, and I'm sure that folks will have questions or thoughts. So as those questions and thoughts come up, be sure to put them in the chat box. And that way, at the end of this presentation, we will have time to answer those questions during the Q&A portion. So just a quick preview, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the climate impacts of building electrification. I'm going to give a quick primer on some of the technologies associated with building electrification. I'll talk about the hazards of gas and the benefits of electrification. And then a little bit later on in the presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the stakeholders that need to be consulted and how folks on this call can make an impact in your community. So next slide. So if you take a look at this pie chart here, we can see that gas in buildings is exacerbating the climate crisis. Gas in buildings is responsible for more than 1/3 of the United States total gas consumption and over 10% of our country's greenhouse gas emissions, which is very significant. This means that we cannot stabilize our climate. We can't stop global warming from getting worse. And if we continue to use gas, which is why it's so important to electrify our buildings. And if you take a look at this quote from the American Gas Association, gas companies connect at least one new house to gas every minute, which means that there are more than 500,000 new gas hookups every year nationwide. So a lot of this presentation is going to be focused on building electrification in new construction, and that's because we need to stop the problem from getting worse. We need to make sure that it's not 500,000 new gas connections every year, it's zero. Next slide. So this bar chart, I think, helps to contextualize California. So California is a critical state to go gas-free in buildings. So there are 10 states that are responsible for more than half of the direct building emissions nationally. And we can see here that California is the second leading emitter behind New York. California's buildings represent 8% of the United States greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. This breaks down, it's roughly 50% from residential, 50% from commercial, with slightly more emissions coming from these residential buildings. So that's the bad news. The good news is that as we electrify California, we can transform the national market for advanced electric appliances like heat pumps. We can normalize electrification as a concept. In my ideal scenario, electrify everything is as common a phrase or an idea as like putting screens on everything, right? We need to make this a normal thing that everybody assumes is in our new homes and buildings. And we need to inspire other states and in fact other countries to follow suit. California is the 5th largest economy in the entire world, and more than 1 in 8 Americans lives in our state. And so the work that we do here can have a significant ripple effect across the country and across the globe. Next slide. So this pie chart just helps to break down further California greenhouse gas emissions by sector. So when we dig into this data, we can see that roughly 17% of California's greenhouse gas emissions are coming from buildings. Our state has some pretty ambitious climate goals. So in order to meet the goal of carbon neutrality by 2045, we need to rapidly decarbonize our building sector. Next slide. So that's just a quick overview of the sort of climate science and greenhouse gas emissions behind the need to electrify. And so what I want to do now is talk a little bit about what we mean specifically when we say electrifying a building. So next slide. So this is what building electrification actually looks like. We can see here that the 2 main appliances that are using gas in our homes are water heaters and space heaters, which collectively are using more than 85% of the gas in homes, and stoves, clothes dryers, and others make up the remaining 10 to 15%. So when we say electrify new construction, we mean replacing our gas water heaters and space heaters with electric heat pump water heaters and electric heat pump space heaters. We mean using induction stoves for cooking and using electric heat pump dryers for clothes drying. Next slide. This is just a very quick summary of the technology behind building electrification. So heat pumps are actually pretty commonplace. I would wager that the vast majority of people on this call already have a heat pump in their home. It's your refrigerator. So heat pumps are cool because they don't generate heat. They simply move it from one location to another. And without getting too into the weeds on how that works, the effect is that these technologies are ultra efficient. They're 3 to 5 times more efficient than their gas counterparts. So even though in California, gas is cheaper per unit than electricity, because these appliances are ultra efficient, they just use a lot less energy. The other technology in building electrification is induction cooking. So there's a big difference between induction cooking and the coils electric stoves that a lot of folks were familiar with. Induction cooking allows you to boil water 50% faster than traditional electric cooktops. The surface of the cooktop remains cool to the touch, and heat is transferred directly into the cookware, not the surface of the cooktop, so your kitchen stays a little bit cooler. So I think this is just important to note because one of the potential issues we see is that folks think that cooking with gas is better than cooking with electric. But when they say electric, folks think about the coil stoves from the 70s and 80s and not the modern induction technologies that are in our new homes and businesses. So I just wanted to flag that. Next slide. So I want to wrap up this first part of my presentation by highlighting some of the other hazards of gas and the benefits of electrification. So there are significant public health risks associated with gas in homes. A recent study found that kids who grow up in homes with gas stoves are 42% more likely to develop asthma compared to kids who grow up in homes without gas stoves. There are safety concerns associated with gas pipelines in our buildings. So in the instance of a natural disaster like a fire or a flood, gas infrastructure is more likely to explode, and it takes longer for these services to be restored compared to their electric counterparts. So when we're thinking about long-term climate resiliency, gas really doesn't have a place in that future. On the flip side, there are a number of benefits to electrifying. So we can bring the clean energy revolution into our homes. Here in California, our grid is only getting greener. We're getting more of our electricity from renewable sources. And so we can start to bring those electric appliances into our homes so we can harness all of this new clean and green energy that's out there. There are also benefits to jobs, which I'm going to get into in a later slide, but the short version is there's a lot of opportunity to provide high road jobs to folks as we electrify California. We can lower bills, both in terms of creating new buildings. So on average, it's cheaper to build a new home all electric by $1,500 per unit in a multifamily building, and cheaper on average by $5,000 for a single family unit compared to building with gas. Folks can also save money on their monthly utility bill by using all electric modern appliances like heat pumps, space heaters, and water heaters. Finally, electrification allows us to erode the power of the gas industry. So even though the gas industry only sells 1/3 of their gas in the US to buildings make up the bulk of the gas industry's revenue because of the upcharge they put on residential customers. So that means that as we begin to electrify our buildings, 5, 10, 15% of buildings, it's going to have an outsized impact on the gas industry's revenue and therefore their political power. So I'm going to pass it back to Amy now, but that's a sort of quick primer for what we mean when we're talking about building electrification.
Thanks, Matt. So you can go ahead and move to the next slide. Again, I'm with the Building Decarbonization Coalition. And as I mentioned, we represent a lot of different members. And so there's certainly a broad swath of representatives and therefore information that we try to bring forth in these conversations. But tonight I have the honor of following up that great introduction about why electrification matters with the information on the next slide, really getting into how local governments are taking that and running with it. So a little bit of an overview here on REACH codes, as we call them, but it's not just limited to REACH codes. So next slide. So you've probably by now heard that expression of what a REACH code is, but just to give some context to the expression, really the intent is that it goes beyond what the state says is the minimum code legal allowance for energy and use in a building. So the energy code, which we're currently under the 2019 code, 2019, which went into effect at the beginning of this year, is the baseline expectation for energy around all new buildings in the state of California. And so REACH codes are stretching or reaching beyond that particular baseline. And so we refer to that for local ordinances at large, but it certainly doesn't just have to go beyond code. Go ahead. So if a local entity, so a city or a county or a town, wants to use a REACH code, they have a preordained pathway to follow. This is really set up by the state, the California Energy Commission, who implements and decides what goes into the state energy code, has this pathway and has for a long time a set of standards of what it means to go for REACH code, because the REACH code helps to define where the code will go next. So those requirements, which will come up often if you're considering one in your town. Cost effectiveness is probably the one we talk about the most. So it does have to prove to be cost effective, whatever it is you're presenting to do. It also has to be non-preempted, which means it has to not conflict with or mandate equipment that goes against federal minimum energy standards. And then the buildings still have to comply with the minimum energy state code. So it has to be better than, not less restrictive than the state code. Next slide. And this process really is multifaceted, but the big place for this particular audience is number one, engaging community stakeholders. And basically that's what we're doing here today is helping you all see what the opportunity looks like, and then understanding what your city, if you haven't acted already, might have as an option to bring forth to affect new construction in their, within their powers. So engaging the local stakeholders yourselves, as well as builders and architects and the design community, so that they understand first and foremost that we're only talking about new construction. That's really important because there's so often misinformation spread around fear, frankly, that a REACH code will come in and force people to make the change within their own homes. It will do that over time because you learn so much about this that you want to make the change, but that's neither here nor there. That's not what a REACH code does. It just affects new construction at this point in time. Then it goes to the City Council or Board of Supervisors for a first reading, just like any other ordinance, as well as a second reading. And then there's some process on the back side where it goes to the Energy Commission, and then the staff gets trained, and then it gets implemented. So you really don't have to worry about the bottom half of this slide. It's really all about engaging stakeholders for the purposes of today. Other things to be considered. So you can require as a local government to have a variety of different things you could do with a REACH code, including requiring electrification for new construction. But you can also look at batteries as either a requirement or allowing space for them in new construction, requiring solar on commercial projects, or making sure that electric vehicles are easy to charge on site, or even having water efficiency. So REACH codes do lots of things. Electrification is just what's really popular right now. Next slide. And so popular that we're up to 40 local governments. And this is pretty both exciting and unprecedented. So I'll just take a moment there to point out that in the past, we've seen half a dozen or so on any single issue pass a REACH code, and to have 40 on a single code cycle, all focused on building electrification, really is, I don't know, I know I'm a code nerd, but I get excited about these things. And the way it breaks down across the cities is, by and large, most cities have gone further than I think any of us ever expected when we started this effort a couple of years ago now. And only a quarter of them are going with an electric preferred option, which is the option that still allows for gas to be installed in homes. That's a smaller percentage than I think we would have anticipated. And a larger percentage are going for the natural gas infrastructure moratoriums, such as San Jose and San Francisco have recently passed. So those are, and in fact, this chart doesn't reflect those, it doesn't reflect San Jose because it happened earlier this week. So there's more to be seen as we go forward. The most popular option really is that all electric REACH code, which uses the energy code and, as a starting point and builds upon it. And in the next slide, I believe, you'll see kind of the breakdown of how this works. So the moratorium really uses a different mechanism altogether. It doesn't use the energy code. It's instead using police powers at the city level. So it's the hardest politically as a result of that, but it also is the longest lasting. You can sort of see why all electric ordinance might be more popular, because it's a little bit easier politically and it still has largely the same effect. You will notice though that in the center column here of an all electric ordinance, there are two common approaches here. One is no gas appliances outright. The other is no gas for elements within the home. So those are two different approaches, and I'll show you a breakdown of how that is played out across the cities in just a moment. And then the electric preferred, again, which, like I said, it allows for gas to be installed, but it actually gives a preferential treatment to buildings that build all electric. Okay, I promised I'd show you the breakdown. All right, so again, my apologies because this does not reflect this week's activities, which has been a busy week. But electric preferred here is, as you can see, the second favorite option. Natural gas moratorium, I don't think anyone ever expected that to be most popular, but all electric reach definitely takes the cake. This is broken down into two different categories though, and as I said, the green bar on the bottom, that is for all electric for the whole building, and the orange on top is for all electric for space and water heating only. So this is important not only because it can help us stop digging the hole, so to speak, when it comes to natural gas and adding new infrastructure and new piping, but it also influences the state. So it's very important in terms of how many cities and also the different approaches start to influence state policy. And so definitely, believe it or not, we are already working on Title 24, the new energy code for the 2022 code, which doesn't go into effect until 2023. So that is happening right now. And looking very carefully at all these model cities across the state and what those 40 cities have done as a leverage point to really influence what happens at the state. So I just put on here, there is an upcoming workshop. If you happen to be interested, it is very weedy and a little bit nerdy, but there are multiple interjection points where organizations like yours can speak up and have your voice be heard when it comes to future code cycles at the statewide as well as the local level. Oh, thank you for your time, and I will pass it back to Joyce, I believe.
Okay, so I think I'm up next. I forgot in the beginning to say who we are, Mothers Out Front. So let me do that really quickly. We're a national movement of mothers and others mobilizing for a livable climate for all children. And we started in 2013 with a small group of mothers in Boston area. And now we're in 8 different states around the country with 46 community-based teams that are led by our volunteers. And we work on many different campaigns depending on what's needed in that local area. So as I said, I coach the San Francisco and San Jose, we call it Silicon Valley. It's more than San Jose teams. You can check out our website later if you're interested in more, but let's go on to the next slide. So what I'm going to do tonight is share with you a case study of how the Mothers Out Front team in Silicon Valley partner with other organizations, other allies, to help pass the nation. It's the city in the nation is the largest city that has a gas ban and reach code. So we're really proud of that. This is a group at the end after the gas ban was passed last October, the first round, celebrating after the victory. So next slide. So the first step for us was to find allies. We joined a local coalition like you guys are doing. It is still called the Campaign for Fossil-Free Buildings in Silicon Valley. It's really led by Menlo Smark, a local group, and there's many, I think about 37 or so local organizations that are partners. Next slide. The first thing we did is what you are doing tonight. We tried to get informed. Our mothers and others in our group had no idea what a reach code was. I, as the organizer, didn't even know. It was brand new to us as of the summer of 2019. And we heard rumors like, oh, San Jose is going to have a reach code. So we were recruited to join this group, and we did a webinar so we could learn more. And basically we framed it as how we can reach for the future for fossil-free buildings for our climate and our kids. Next slide. We also started by really framing it positively. A lot of folks are really resistant to be told what they can't do. And so even though we were going for a ban on gas, we framed it as the benefits of all electric buildings. So they save money, as Matt talked about, they improve health, they advance equity, and most of all for us, they create a safer, healthier future for us and our children. So next page. Once we had learned about what reach code was and why buildings should be electric, we started lobbying our city council members, the staff, and the mayor. We sent an official letter from our group, and we had people generate emails into the city council members asking them to pass the strongest possible reach code. The first version of it was really weak. So yes, right here, we published a letter to the editor and we told them like, hey, it's great, you're on the right track, but you should strengthen this reach code. We especially advocated, as you can see in the bottom paragraph, for that all new parking spaces have EV chargers, because if we can do that, we can remove barriers to EV adoption for folks that live in like apartment buildings at places where they can't charge in their own home. And the next one, after we did letters to the editor, we also had a social media campaign. We raged, it was our first Twitter storm. It was super exciting. We got a lot of participation. And so we pretty much boosted the council members and the mayor who had come out with a memo strengthening the REACH code. And we asked the others to support it as well. Next slide. The day of the vote, we got a lot of more media coverage. The mayor actually invited Mothers Out Front to be the community partner to speak at a press conference. You can see our volunteer leader, Susan Butler Graham, there leading it, and those of us in the background holding our signs. And after that press conference, when she spoke, about 4 different organizations, TV and print journalists interviewed her for more coverage of the issue. Next slide. Very important is we showed up at the city council meeting. Mothers Out Front likes to sit out front, in front, right in the front or second to the front row. With our signs, we bring our kids and we show how much the public wants this. My daughter drew that sign on the far left, just really heartfelt and gets the point across in a pretty unique way. Next slide. They actually voted unanimously to pass this REACH code, and they also proposed to come back the next month with a gas ban. So we were ecstatic and we had a great celebration, as you could see. Maybe go back for 1 minute. I want to talk about the importance of getting a photo like this, because now this photo is like everywhere. So it just shows the public behind it, the enthusiasm. So make sure you take lots of photos, especially even on Zoom, we can take photos. Okay, next slide. We also found it really important to thank our leaders and our allies. So we tweeted thanks to them. One of our members drew that picture thanking Mayor Lacarta, who took a big leadership role, but really important to get that public recognition. And next slide. We also shouted out in the letter to the editor, again, to praise the city council for doing that, and also other local officials in other neighboring cities who had done similar things, giving them credit so they can continue that good work. And next slide. Then we started spreading to other cities. So we went down to Morgan Hill, the town south of San Jose, helped them pass a gas ban, and to many other cities in Silicon Valley. And we also hosted a webinar last August because the city of Los Altos was facing a huge fight. A lot of people were really dug in, and we thought we got to educate more people about what REACH codes are, why it's important to go all electric for our health and our climate. So we did a webinar for mostly Los Altos and for Sunnyvale and others who wanted to come. Okay, next slide. Oh, go back one more time to that slide, because what's so cool about this is that this webinar was led by 2 of our volunteers who just a year before had never even heard of a REACH code. And yet they had learned so much over that year that they felt confident enough to give this presentation. It's just the 2 of them. I kind of just coached in the background, but they did it. So again, it seems a little wonky at first, but it's really not that complicated. You don't have to know all the engineering of it. You have to just know why it's important and push for it. Okay, and the next slide, we're almost done. Just this Tuesday, San Jose came back to vote on an expanded gas ban ordinance to bring it to all buildings, not just the low rise that were in the first round, but now to high rise and commercial. But what we found is that it was very important to partner with labor, because the pipe fitters are very worried because their job is to install pipes, especially pipes that carry natural gas. So we actually had conversations with the pipe fitters to see where we might have common alignment. And kudos to them, they are coming out in favor. They came out in favor of the REACH, of the gas ban, but they wanted accommodations where the buildings would have to be required to have more water efficiency methods, and that would basically boost purple pipes and other things that the pipe fitters could do. So they could continue to have good jobs, but also support a clean energy economy for all of our benefits. So yeah, one thing I'll warn to, this is the last thing I'll say, and I'm going to pass it on, I think, back to Matt. But one thing that we also found is that a company named Bloom Energy, which produces fuel cells, swooped in the day before the vote was supposed to go and wanted to get an exemption for their fuel cells. And basically, the fuel cells they produce are not clean. They are hooked up to the gas pipelines. The gas provides the energy for the chemical reaction that creates electricity. So Bloom Energy put this, purple pipes are basically the pipes that carry water, not gas. So, sorry, I was answering a question in the chat because that was her clarification. But what I want to say about this is that they brought out all their lobbyists, their heavy hitters, one of the most influential persons in Silicon Valley. So we really had to go to bat to resist this. And we actually almost got it out of the code, but they did pass it. And it's something to be aware of. If there's other kinds of distributed energy resources that try to get into your code, they can really undermine the gas ban because they will be hooked up to gas infrastructure. So be aware of that in San Diego, because that happened in San Jose, unfortunately. So we're still trying to work on that, but warning. Okay, that's all for the case study. I'll answer questions at the end, but I'll pass it on to Matt for now.
Awesome. Thanks, Linda. So yeah, I want to spend a little bit of time and just dig a little further into this question of where is labor on electrification. And I think that the general answer is that it's largely a mixed response influenced by the local utility. So in broad strokes, we have seen a more positive response to building electrification in Pacific gas and electric territory, which is largely in Northern California, because the utility there provides both gas and electricity. And so they have a pathway forward in terms of their business. In Southern California, we've seen opposition from SoCalGas and from SDG&E, and that has, in some instances, bled over into opposition, or at least a not warm reception by some of the labor folks. But also, labor is a big tent. It isn't just limited to sort of pipe fitters or folks who are in the gas utility space. There are folks in SEIU and other types of labor that are potentially sort of interested in supporting this work. So there isn't sort of one sort of clear answer, but in this slide, I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done to help answer some of these questions and put a little more nuance in here. So one of the big, I think, opportunities in building electrification and with labor comes from a jobs report that was done by both UCLA and UC Berkeley. This job report found that in a high building electrification scenario in California, we could add over 100,000 new jobs in the next 20 years. And these are largely high road jobs, so jobs that are paying family sustaining wages. And it really raises the question, if our state is moving towards carbon neutrality by 2045, we need to start planning for that transition now. And a part of that planning is making sure that the job market sort of transforms, and the folks who have good paying jobs in the labor sector now have new opportunities for engagement in or employment in our green future. And so this jobs report is one of the first efforts at sort of understanding what that transition can look like. Linda raised another good flag. So plumbers and pipe fitters are some of the unions who would potentially be impacted fairly negatively from building electrification if we just looked at it in a vacuum. But we've seen in a number of places interest from the plumbers and pipe fitters in supporting building electrification in exchange for support for programs and policies like dual piping gray water ordinances. So for example, in San Francisco, they had an all electric requirement for new construction pass in the last month. And the Board of Supervisors there also committed to a gray water dual piping system. And because of that, the pipe fitters actually came out and supported the all electric ordinance for new construction, which was pretty historic. I think that there are still questions to be answered around whether or not it truly makes sense to bundle and scale building electrification with dual piping and gray water ordinances. But I wanted to share this example because the seeds of collaboration and unity are there. And as y'all are doing this work in San Diego, that is something that you should sort of lean into and try and understand more instead of potentially straying away from. So there are other potential policies to support unionized jobs from electrification as well. So ideas like district energy, aggregated residential electrification with job standards, PLAs, things like that. So there isn't a definitive answer on where labor is at on electrification, but there are instances of positive collaboration that have happened across the state already. And we're going to continue to lean into that in the coming year. And I would encourage you all to do the same. Next slide. So in this slide, I want to talk about another really important stakeholder. So equity and justice need to be at the center of this work. Environmental justice communities are important stakeholders when we're thinking about building electrification. And so specifically, electrification needs to prioritize low-income housing and needs to be prioritized in communities of color, places that have historically been left out of the green revolution in California and across the country. And we need to focus on the health impacts of electrification. We need to focus on resiliency, and we need to make sure that we are lowering utility bills and not displacing people. And how do we do that? You need to make sure that as you're building your coalition and as you're designing these policies at the local level, those voices are represented. So partnering with affordable housing groups, with community groups, and with equity groups to advocate for combined policies, reach codes, and things like coordinated repair and renovation, and efficiency and electrification investments can go a really long way in crafting a more holistic policy. There's some key things that we want to avoid. So displacement and increased rent are front among them. So you could imagine a scenario where a landlord might decide to renovate a building that they own with all electric appliances, but at the same time then decide to increase the rent by 50%. If that were to happen, it would displace some people and it would make it a lot harder for other people to get by on a monthly basis. So as we're designing these policies, we need to make sure that there are protections in place to not displace people and to not increase rents. Another thing that I think is worth flagging is that we don't want to have the cost of the gas infrastructure land on communities who can least afford it. So we know that in the coming years, the price of gas in California is expected to spike as fewer and fewer people are on the gas system. And so as there are fewer people, there will be less rate players to spread the cost among, and that's going to increase prices. So we need to make sure that we're electrifying communities of color and low-income communities first, so that those folks are insulated from the spiking gas prices that we know are going to come in the coming years and decades. So I think this is just really important to flag. And when you're thinking about your work, it's important to be asking, who are you talking to in the community? What groups are represented? And if you don't have environmental justice groups in your inner circle, you should take intentional steps to include those folks, A, because it's the right thing, and B, because you're going to get smarter and more effective policy in your community, and ultimately you're going to be able to win bigger. Next slide. The other thing that I want to flag for folks is that the gas industry is not going to take all this lying down. The gas industry is aware of the electrification movement that is happening in California. You can see this quote by the WISPA president, which stands for the Western States Petroleum Association. Can you imagine if every local municipality takes up this issue? It's death by 1,000 cuts. So they recognize the threat that building electrification poses to their industry and are acting accordingly. So for example, in the city of San Luis Obispo, which is in Southern California gas service territory, when they were voting on their building electrification ordinance, SoCal Gas sent up dozens of utility workers to give false and misleading comments to the city council to try and dissuade them from voting on their electrification ordinance. Luckily, the council was well informed and had climate champs on it, so it was still adopted. But it's a good example of the pushback that you might expect. In other cities, we've seen the gas industry use AstroTurf groups to try and spread doubt and misinformation. And in places where the gas industry has influence and power, they will directly lobby and try to influence city council members and get them to do things like what San Jose did with Bloom, or to carve out exemptions for certain building types, or to delay the implementation date. There's a lot of different ways that the gas industry will try and push back on our policies. But the good news here is that we can overcome this opposition with smart organizing because these policies just make sense. They're better for public health, they're more affordable for people, and they're better for the climate. And so if we have a broad coalition of stakeholders who support this effort, we can overcome these attempts by the gas industry to undermine the electorate future that we need. So next slide. So I want to close my portion of this presentation with a reiteration of what you all can do to influence your city. These tactics are the very things that we did in the 40 cities across California that have already adopted building electrification policies, and they're proven to work. So doing education and lobbying meetings with city council members and staff can go a really long way. Building electrification is kind of a weird and wonky issue if you haven't heard of it before. And so just having those one-on-one meetings can go a long way in getting a council person or a staff person up to speed so they can then
It's listed on there, we've done.
So that's something that you can do. Giving comments to public meetings goes a really long way as well. The elected officials just need to see that the community cares about this so that they can move forward with it. Coalition building and outreach is also super critical. So that's literally what we're doing right now. Just making sure that you have a broad array of voices at the table. So the environmental groups are always good candidates to reach out to and include, but also make sure that you're talking to the environmental justice groups, labor organizations, public health officials, so like doctors, nurses, folks who work in healthcare, builders and developers, affordable housing folks. All of these constituencies stand to benefit from electrification, and so it's worth your time to try and bring them into the tent to have a louder voice. Doing media work matters, so elected officials care about what the local paper says, so getting in letters to the editors or writing op-eds go a long way. And social media posts that tag council members also makes an impact. So most of your council people are probably on Twitter, and that's a really easy way to make sure that they see exactly what you're thinking. So take advantage of these tools that we have. And then finally, grassroots advocacy, the tried and true petition efforts, getting more volunteers and activists involved, and putting on public events when we can do that in non-COVID times. So these tactics as a part of a broader strategy can go a really long way in electrifying our building. And I'm super excited to see what we can get done in the San Diego region in 2021. So that's what I've got. I'm going to pass it over, I think now to Anne, but I appreciate you all again being here and taking the time to listen to this presentation and learn and to go out and do the work. So Anne, back to you.
Okay. So as Joyce mentioned in the beginning, San Diego 350 is establishing a coalition of many environmental groups, environmental justice groups, as well as architects, labor, and other groups. Our coalition is called the San Diego Building Electrification Coalition. Could you go back one slide? And we had our kickoff meeting just 2 weeks ago. This is a brand new coalition. And at that meeting, we had representatives from 28 organizations. The mission for our coalition is to educate the community and elected officials about the importance of building electrification and to advocate for the adoption of building electrification ordinances in cities throughout the San Diego region. We welcome more organizations to join our coalition, and I believe the link for this is or will be coming up in the chat. And also for individuals, please join us. When we had our kickoff meeting 2 weeks ago, we established working groups, including education and outreach, messaging, campaign strategy, research on model ordinances, technical training, and liaison groups. So would welcome more volunteers for any of these groups. And again, there should be a link coming up soon in the chat for that. And at the bottom of the slide, you can see how you could contact us. San Diego 350, not 250, sorry, typo there. So be@sandiego350.org. Okay, and Joyce, or who is monitoring the Q&A now?
So Shayla and Cam have been monitoring the Q&A, and I think we can probably, you can stop screen sharing now, Wendy. Great, so Shayla,
All right.
you want to go ahead and start asking?
Yeah, I'll go. Okay, so the first question we have is, if building electrification takes off, how do we avoid a whack-a-mole scenario where this decrease in demand pushes down gas prices, leading it to be more attractive for electricity generation relative to other options?
So I think this was answered in the chat, but I think it's actually the effect will be the opposite. So as more jurisdictions electrify, the cost of gas is actually going to increase for individual users because there are less customers to spread the cost of the gas infrastructure across. So, you're not just paying for your gas when you're paying your gas bill, you're paying for the pipes and for everything else that it goes to installing all that. And so there's going to be less people to pay those costs. And because there's less people, the cost will go up. So I think the opposite is what will actually happen. And that's one of the things that I referenced in my presentation. And if you want to get some more information on that, an organization called E3, which is Environment, Energy, and Economics, did a really good analysis that helps to sort of outline exactly how that is going to happen and what that curve might look like.
Yeah, thank you for that important point on how it'll disproportionately impact communities of color and concern. That was important.
Okay, the next question in the chat was, how would an industrial building raise steam without gas? A little background, it says San Diego is California's craft beer capital. This person is presently taking a technology of brewing course at UCSD. Electric heating is a poor way to heat a boil kettle as the elements frequently fail and they also tend to burn the product. Fired kettles are better for a small brewer. Steam jacketed kettles are more efficient but require more capital equipment. This takes us back to how do you raise steam?
I can take a stab at this, but Amy and Linda, if you want to jump in afterwards, I'll start with I am not an expert on steam, so this will just be a more general answer. But I think that there is been a ton of development of all electric technology in the last like 5 to 10 years, specifically in like cooking applications. And I imagine that might expand to steam. And so I'm not sure of like how much sort of research has gone into how to create steam with all electricity, but I imagine that there might be alternatives out there that maybe the craft brew industry could use. And then from like a broader point, I would argue that, it may be true that like right now it's better to create steam with fire than electricity. But for the sake of like the broader climate movement, like we still should probably move in the direction of electrification and then figure out the sort of technology behind steam generation from electricity down the road. But like addressing climate change is the bigger issue and is more important. And then the final piece that I would put to that is that, there's still opportunities to get gas that is not through a pipeline. So you could have like on-site deliveries if you like need to have a gas flame in a very specific application, i.e. craft brew in San Diego. So that's my attempt at that answer. I don't know a ton about steam. Amy and Linda, if you want to add anything to that.
I think you did a pretty good job there, Matt. There's definitely, it appears that we have some engineers in the room with us, so I hate to step on their toes, but in general, it's true that if there's an application where there is not a technology, there's always the opportunity to bring in canister-based fuel sources. But I would suspect, and also I am not an expert nor a brewer of any kind, but that others have addressed this in some way, shape, or form, and I don't know the answer offhand of what technology is out there, but we can find out for sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think Tom addressed it in the chat. Some of the questions that were addressed in the chat, we'll just repeat just in case to make sure that panelists have a chance to respond if they have some other pieces of info or perspectives. But if no one else wants to jump in on that, we can move on.
Yeah, I'm the engineer who asked the question. and every large facility I worked in had a gas-fired boiler. So I think it's going to be a common question that's going to come up for you. So it'll be good to know the answer.
Totally. That'll be something to look into. Thanks for raising it.
Thank you, Matt.
All right. So then the next question that we have, well, it's more of a request. Please comment on recharge times of heat pump versus natural gas water heaters.
That's an interesting one that I don't know off the top of my head what the comparative is, because so many folks have the tankless these days. And there definitely is a lag if you use up all of the hot water compared to a tankless. Matt, is that something that you've come across before? We need an engineer on their panel. Go ahead.
Yeah, Carl, did you have a thought on that? I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, and Tom and a bunch of folks on here could probably answer it. The heat pumps are definitely slower to recharge. They work over a long time, and that's one of the reasons why we appreciate their efficiency. The heat pump water heaters that are sold on the market today are hybrids, so they have heating elements in them as well. So if you demand a lot from them, they can keep up at a lower efficiency, and then if you demand less from them, they keep up at much higher efficiency. So they're sort of the best of both worlds right now, and that's probably how they'll continue to build them.
Awesome. Thanks, Carl.
Okay.
Jose
everyone-
offered to weigh in as well, I see in the chat.
I just wanted to say something about industrial heat and industrial processes in general. There's a lot of interest in using solar power to make hydrogen, in as much as there's at this point surplus solar power during the day. And there's a lot of interest in electrolyzers as a way to store solar power by making hydrogen. And there's interest in injecting hydrogen into the methane distribution system with the idea of at some point, at least part of the methane distribution system becoming a hydrogen distribution system. That's not really a practical thing to use in homes, but probably there will be a remnant of the methane distribution system to large industrial facilities and possibly to power plants. There's a power plant in Los Angeles, probably the last gas power plant that will ever be built in California, was built specifically with turbines that are designed to burn anything from 100% methane to 100% hydrogen. And the intent is that there's a storage facility, an electrolyzer facility going to be built somewhere out of state where there's a cavern where they can store hydrogen. And the intent is over time, they'll start making hydrogen with solar power, storing it, injecting it into a gas pipeline that runs to LA. And over the next decade or so, they'll use a higher and higher percentage of hydrogen in this plant until eventually it's running on pure hydrogen. And probably to the speaker who was asking about how are we going to have high temperature steam or industrial processes that require by their nature flames. The answer for large scale industrial processes may be that they'll run to hydrogen. And so there may be a remnant of the methane distribution system left serving industrial processes. And that may be the answer. But for buildings and for individual homes, electrification is definitely going to be the way to go. I can answer more questions about that if anybody asks.
Well, actually, I was talking to somebody who said that in Europe, they're already using hydrogen and piping it into homes, and they don't have to change out the infrastructure or appliances.
To a small percentage, Although I have a suspicion that some of that is sort of greenwashing by the natural gas companies who want an excuse to keep sending natural gas. You can add a small percentage of hydrogen to the natural gas system without damaging anything. There is an issue that hydrogen will diffuse into certain metals and make them brittle. So there has to be some careful study and thought made if you mix hydrogen into a system that wasn't designed to take it. So that is an issue there. That's one of the things that makes me think that it may be practical to put hydrogen into large distribution lines where you can afford the cost of coating them or replacing them if you have to. But I find it hard to believe that it would actually be practical to put it into the small scale distribution lines going to everybody's house.
Well, my understanding was that if you have like galvanized pipes and stuff like that, that won't work in that environment. But if you have PVC piping,
Yeah, PVC piping would definitely work.
So,
But that's a very big question. I think certainly the companies in Europe that are doing that are seemingly hoping that they can remain in business by switching over to being hydrogen companies. I haven't seen any indication that the American gas companies are latching onto that. But it would be one
sorry to
way for them
interrupt.
to.
I think we have to move on to the next
Okay,
question.
yeah.
If you want to continue explaining that in the chat, that would be really helpful because I'm sure there are so many questions to get to. I think Cam was going to read the next one.
Yes, so for time, I moved on to a different question than was listed.
Oh, we can't hear you. Oh, it looks like you might be freezing. Okay, I'll ask the next
Important
question.
for advising B.
Do you mind repeating that?
So the question was, how does SB 1477 relate to the Title 24 update? Are they complementary, independent, or codependent?
Yeah, so I'll take this one. SB 1477 is a funding program. There's multiple parts to it, but I'll keep it simple and say they're complementary. And as of right now, most of that money is going to existing buildings to help with the conversion, especially for affordable housing units. And the build program, which will go to new construction, is likely going to go to similar kinds of buildings.
Thank you.
Thanks. And then Amy, someone was wondering if there's a link for the webinar on Title 24 that was mentioned. I think that was for you.
Yeah, and I sent you the information page, but I'll send you, I'll put it in the chat. Give me 1 second.
Oh, that was, thank you.
I guess one thing to build on that, I guess, Amy, just a super quick question. Did you talk about how the city work plays into the CEC strategy? I might have missed that, but if not, I kind of want to touch on it for a quick minute.
Yeah, so I did speak to it briefly, but yeah, effectively the REACH codes in general inform the future code cycles, and that's really the main thing. So we're looking at all the existing 40 cities and leveraging those for the 2022 code.
Totally. And I think just for this group specifically, you know, the bulk of the REACH codes that we have passed in the last year and a half have been primarily in like Northern California, or like in some instances, Central California. And so to like really get the CEC over the finish line and to encourage them to like adopt an all electric baseline in 2022, like we think that we need case studies from all across California. And so if we can get REACH codes passed in the San Diego region over the course of 2021, it fits sort of nicely into this like broader effort to electrify. And instead of having a patchwork, like an effective patchwork of cities that have passed these codes, we could have one standard for all construction in California in the next couple of years. So I think that the work that we are able to do in this area and the work that you all are going to do over the next year could go a long way in determining whether California has an all electric standard starting in 2023 or in 2026. So just to reinforce that point.
Okay, so I will move on to the next question. So if everyone converts from natural gas to electric, how much beefing up will the grid require? There were points made about going through rolling blackouts recently, and essentially how can we keep the lights on if everyone goes electric?
Matt, you want to go for it?
I'll go first, and then if you want to jump in, or Linda, please, if you want to throw in your 2 cents, I don't want to dominate.
It's okay. I'm chatting about induction stoves. Go for it.
Cool. Well, so one thing, so we're not talking about, even though the scale of the climate crisis probably requires that we electrify all of our buildings like right now, that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about these building electrification reach codes. We're talking about electrifying new construction at a city level in California. And so the question of like, will this put an undue strain on the grid and cause rolling blackouts at this pace? No. The other question though about like gas and versus electricity in terms of resilience, most modern gas appliances, so like gas appliances that have been made in the last 15 to 20 years, like require electricity to start. So in the instance of a blackout, you're likely not going to be able to use your gas appliances or your electric appliances. So I think that that's like one of the points that the gas industry likes to like peddle as a reason to not electrify. But the reality is like if your home is entirely dark and you're not gonna be able to turn on any of your appliances. And even if you can just light your gas stove because it's like older, like your house is going to be dark and your fridge isn't going to be working and like nothing else is going to be working. And so like, is that really like a resilient home? I would argue that it's not. And then I guess the final piece of that is like California's grid is like continuing to get greener. And like, I think as it gets greener, it's getting more resilient. And so blackouts are a thing we're going to have to continue to grapple with in the coming years, but I don't think that building electrification is going to make it worse than it is now.
Yeah, so I'll just add that even when you're talking about converting existing buildings, there's a lot of excess capacity on the grid today to accommodate for our summer cooling load. And most of what we're talking about adding is heating, because we're going to be heating with electricity as well. So there actually is that excess capacity that we can utilize within the grid. Where we're going to need expansion of the total grid itself actually comes much more directly to electric vehicles, frankly. So grid expansion is necessary, as is grid hardening, so that we don't get any blackouts or minimize them at any rate. It's a great question though.
And I'll just try one more thing is that these concerns were what actually allowed the exemption for fuel cells to be passed in San Jose, because a certain data centers, other businesses can't afford to have any power shutoffs. So they advocated they needed to have these fuel cells, which provide continuous 24/7, 365 energy. So I would be really prepared for the fear mongering around power shutoffs. That was a big issue for us. And at the last minute, it was kind of too late. We did find a really excellent resource. So having engineers and builders who've done this is really important. We found somebody from the Smith Group that was able to actually point out there's other ways to get backup power. But I would definitely be prepared for that question and have some good answers.
Thank you all for answering the question.
Relevant to the backup power thing,
is
Microsoft is using hydrogen.
I'm sorry. Okay. Sorry. So, is there a macro available where we can input efficiencies of gas and electric appliances along with prices to determine cost of use?
So I know that there are some piloted options out there in terms of software that would allow for consumers to start to test this in terms of trying to establish for your own home if you're going to make the switch. None of them are in full production as of today that I know of. But if anybody knows of one that's readily available and accurate, love to hear about it.
Thank you for answering that question.
Thanks. All right. And the next question we had is, what is the trade-off between gas appliances and increased use of natural gas for electric power generation for electric appliances? I can repeat that if necessary.
So I'll just jump in and say that the trade-off really has to do with the longevity more than anything. So I don't know what the number is if we were to make a big switch to all electric right now today in terms of added capacity needs from our natural gas powered plants. But the fact of the matter is that our electricity grid is getting cleaner and cleaner over time and is mandated to do so by law. So as this transition occurs, I believe the question becomes less and less relevant, but others are welcome to join it.
Thank you.
Okay, and because SDG&E is owned by Sempra and they sold off all the renewables and appear to be totally focused on LNG, would this impact their positioning and therefore their employees' positions on moving away from gas?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think, Sempra broadly has been like, they're the parent company to like a number of gas companies, and they have been sort of fighting us across California and in other states. And so I think that Sempra's perception of electrification definitely colors SDG&E's perception of it, and therefore the employees and the groups that they have relationships with in the community.
Thank you for answering that question.
All right. Were you going to say something, Joyce?
I was just going to see if we had any more questions.
Yeah, we do. So let me see. This is probably one that others are thinking of. So we mentioned, or you all mentioned existing buildings, but this person couldn't recall if you said, would existing homes require change outs to electric, meaning no new gas appliances installed?
I don't
So
believe that's not been mandated yet. I think where it might come in is with retrofits. Some of the codes have been saying that when you retrofit a certain percentage of your property, then you kind of are considered a new building. But Amy, go ahead. You were going to answer too.
Yeah, so all of the REACH codes deal with new construction and what's defined by each individual city as a major renovation. Typically that is 80% or more fully rebuilt. So it generally will not affect existing buildings at this point in time.
Yeah, and there are some communities that are starting to look at like what it would mean to have like an existing building policy. So like the city of Berkeley was one of the first to do like an all electric ordinance back in or I guess the middle of 2019. And so now they're looking at ways to try and tackle the existing building stock. And so, one of the ideas is like a certain percentage of a rebuild. Another one is like a cost threshold. So if you're spending more than $100,000 on a retrofit, you need to either install the wiring to be all electric capable in the future, or just to make it all electric. Another potential option is a point of sale policy. So when you sell your house, one of the sort of upgrades or things that you need to do is to make it electric ready or to have all electric appliances. These are all policy ideas. We haven't seen them sort of implemented widely yet, but there are some communities that are starting to look at what would make sense. I don't think that in the initial work that folks here are doing, you would want to couple existing buildings with new construction. I think it's cleaner to do new construction first and then tackle existing buildings as a way to start to generate momentum. But I don't know, that's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I really agree, because a lot of the fear comes from people saying they're going to come and take my gas stove. So if you could just emphasize this is new buildings, it won't affect your current home. The other thing other policy idea that's out there is called replace on demand, I think, or replace on burnout, sorry. So that like when your gas stove dies, to be prepared to replace it with a heat pump water heater. So that really involves a lot of education of the contractors as well, because a lot of them are still really wedded to the old technology. So people in our group who wanted to put in heat pump water heaters were told by contractors, don't do that. It's going to be much more expensive. And they had to really just work so hard to find a contractor that would actually put in a heat pump water heater. So anyway, it's a different issue. That's more like on existing buildings, but for the REACH codes and gas bans, definitely focus on new construction.
Awesome, thank you. The next question, is the goal of the SDB coalition to get ordinances passed instead of REACH codes, or is the ordinance necessary first to get the REACH code?
Oh, thank you for asking that question. So the ordinance is the REACH code. The ordinance is the city action that allows for either a REACH code or a gas moratorium. So it's the function that the city possesses is the ordinance itself. So it's one and the same, but it is just a little bit confusing around the words themselves.
Thank you. Another good question. So we know SDG&E has been going to cities for some time telling them that gas bans are a terrible idea. Are there elected officials in cities who've passed bans who are champions who we can connect people with?
Totally. Yeah, there definitely are. I think that might be an instance of like if you've got sort of elected officials who want to like talk to other city elected officials who've done this, like follow up with Amy and Linda and I, and we can definitely put you in touch. Like top of mind, Kate Harrison in the city of Berkeley is awesome. The mayor of San Luis Obispo did some really good work. There's a number of elected officials in Northern California and really across California who are fired up about this, and I think would be happy to talk to electeds in San Diego to share their perspective.
Let me just interject here. The original plan was to end at 8 o'clock, and I think there've been a lot of questions. So maybe we can take a couple more questions and then save the questions, and maybe we can respond in an email to people as a follow-up. Maybe if you don't mind, Linda and Amy and Matt, we can ask you some follow-up questions and send out to people if that's all right. Unless people want to stay for a few more minutes, but I know we were going to try to end by 8. So
I think we were also going to, in the follow-up email, give all 3 of the speakers contact information. So if people want to ask questions directly to the speakers, they'll have an opportunity to do that directly.
right. Okay. So maybe just maybe 2 more questions, and then I suggest we wrap it up. So Cam, I think you're next to ask a question.
Okay. Danced around a bit. Some of these questions already got answered. Okay. Building electrification is great. I wonder how equity will be addressed, especially places like San Diego where gas is much cheaper than electricity. Low-income people will have to pay more. Will the state or city help them to pay?
Yeah, it's like I can take a stab at this. So I think in many instances, like the sort of inverse is true with electrification, where like folks actually are going to be paying less money in terms of their like monthly utility bills if they have all electric heat pump space heaters and water heaters in their homes. I think the question, or some of the questions in my mind are like, how do we make sure that low income communities and communities of color are like actually getting these appliances into their homes and buildings? And I think in those instances, and that's mostly a question of existing buildings, right? And so I think that does require funding from regulatory agencies in California and legislation in Sacramento that pays for these appliances so that low-income folks are not burdened with a requirement to have these new technologies without any source to pay for them. So this idea of like more funding from the regulatory agencies fits into our state strategy. So if we can prove that electrification is viable in all of these cities, it makes it more likely that the regulatory agents will scale electrification. And part of that scaling is money for low-income communities and communities of color. And then the other piece, just to circle back to the slide on environmental justice, there needs to be safeguards built into electrification policy so that we are guaranteeing that there are not rent increases and that there's not displacement from these policies. So there's an organization called Greenlining that has put out a report called Equitable Electrification that really gets into the details for what this policy can actually look like. And I definitely encourage folks to read through that. It's a really helpful framework for understanding the nuance here.
Thank you so much for that awesome answer and the resources. So the last question we have, hopefully won't get too much into the weeds, but where is the additional electric power going to come from for 24/7 base load or for peaking?
Yeah, so I think that's actually a similar question to one we heard earlier about what extra capacity we might need. But for those who maybe are less familiar with what's happening with the electricity grid at large, the state of California has a requirement that we will be 100% renewable electricity by 2045. So regardless of what happens right now, eventually that will need to be a renewable power source.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for participating. And I want to thank Cam and Sheila for moderating the chat and Wendy for showing the slides and our wonderful speakers, Matt, Linda, and Amy. We will be sending a follow-up email next week, and we'll have a recording of this program, and also we'll have contact information for Amy, Linda, and Matt. And if there were some dangling questions, we can send out the answers to those. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, I'll just flag very quickly. Amanda put in the chat, if your organization is interested in joining the coalition, use that actionnetwork.org link. And if you yourself are interested in volunteering, make sure that you fill out that Google form there. We need you in this movement.
Yay, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks.
A great group. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night.
Night, everybody.
Night.
Night.
Exciting or what?